My name is Grant Andrews, and this is my presentation for the ERT webinar series called Press Pause. The title of my presentation is Possibilities for Critical Literacy in Large Group Online Teaching in South African Higher Education. So I'll be showing examples from one of the courses that I taught this year and looking at how critical literacy can be made possible in this online space that we're working in. So the three topics I'll cover today in this brief presentation. The first one is looking at the critical literacy approach and speaking about how it's been conceived largely in the classroom. Secondly, I'll show examples of my approach, and then I'll speak about what I learned in the way that I presented and what I'll do differently going forward. Critical literacy is a field that is very aware of context and is responsive to contexts. So thinking about it in a new context is quite interesting, this emergency remote teaching context. What critical literacy is essentially is a study of the relationship between language or texts and power within different contexts. So critical literacy takes a social justice approach. It's an approach to teaching in many different subject areas, but particularly in literacy and in English studies, that it's manifest quite a bit, and as well as in history and politics and many other fields. But it always has this social justice approach in trying to look at how power is reproduced in the way that we represent our societies and speak about our societies, or the text that we use within those societies. So it includes practices of critical language awareness, critical discourse analysis, critical visual literacy. But when I'm teaching the essential basic skills at undergrad level, I work with this basic understanding of how texts reinforce or challenge power within a society. So Ferreira's recent chapter on critical literacy says that critical literacy is a chameleon literacy. So it's ever shifting and ever changing within societies. So how does it shift when we actually don't have that classroom space? How does it shift and how should we shift to accommodate the online space as a critical literacy space? Now, classroom discussions have often been seen as quite essential to the critical literacy practices. So if you search, do a literature review for critical literacy, you'll see the word classroom appear very often in most of the writing that has been done around critical literacy. So the classroom seems to be implied and as an element that is very important in critical literacy practice. A few scholars have now looked at online approaches to critical literacy. What I've found so far has been looking at online discussions as supplemental really to classroom practices. So saying that we can use online exercises to supplement what happens in the classroom. But many scholars have been looking at critical literacy as really happening in that classroom discussion space. And a large part of my teaching has been based on conversation. When I teach from this critical literacy framework and perspective, conversation is essential and is central to what I do. So I ask students, I'll show them text, so I'll bring text to the class, I'll break them up into small little groups, so I'll tell them to talk to the person sitting next to them and really consider what meaning do you see in texts, how is it different from what someone else might see, how do we disagree about texts, how does language operate differently in different contexts, and what subject position do you come from that might change the way that you relate to certain texts or understand certain texts that someone else doesn't come from. So these kinds of things are really well done in conversation within the classroom space. So we think about subjective experiences quite often in these meaning-making processes and then see their positions as intersecting with the meanings that they make in different texts. And in first-year students, which is the group that I worked with for this media studies course that I'll be speaking about today, this muscle really hasn't been exercised much. They still don't really see language and text as operating in the ways that we speak about from the critical literacy perspective. So it's really about showing how to do this in step-by-step processes that really work with texts very closely. And the classroom is fantastic for this. And some other issues with online critical literacy pedagogy, in addition to there being no more classroom for these types of very close discussions of texts, is that the traditional lecture really doesn't work well for critical literacy approach. So what we've been doing is similar to what I'm doing here. We'll record a narrated PowerPoint, post it online, and this will be the way that we can reach especially a large group where people don't have access to enough data to go onto Zoom and for us to have real nice conversations. So the traditional lecture where there's one lecturer explaining concepts and unpacking all of it for an hour to a group of people sitting and watching doesn't really work well for critical literacy. So class discussions is the space of sometimes quite heated discussions, especially when I speak about topics that students are not really comfortable engaging with. There might be quite a bit of pushback, and the classroom is a great space to mediate that and to really discuss why these feelings of discomfort come up. So a pedagogy of discomfort is quite important in critical literacy practice at times. So topics, I find that race actually has become a bit less controversial to discuss. So speaking about race doesn't seem to be as heated in these discussions, but the topics that I'm working with in quite a lot of my classes these days are ideas of social class, gender roles and sexuality, and these topics really make a lot of students quite uncomfortable. So not being able to actually work through that discomfort in a one-on-one synchronous type of conversation is a big challenge with critical literacy. So I would kind of scaffold and prompt and have group conversations and work very closely with texts on these topics in order to make sure that we can cover them in the social justice imperative that critical literacy works with. But in online lessons, it might be kind of, the discomfort might be left to the individual themselves, which might not always be as productive. So how do we kind of work with that in the online space? So how to teach it when we couldn't have the holding space of the classroom? And what did we do, or what did I at least attempt to do to work with critical literacy in the online space? Is it even possible? And I'm not 100% sure yet. I'm not even 50% sure yet, but I have seen some promising signs based on this first year course that I've taught. So these are some of the signs that I saw. Forum engagement was great. So I could really see them grappling with the concepts. I could see them grappling with the social justice issues we spoke about. Conversations were taking place. They applied the concepts to real world contexts, which was fantastic. The exam responses were also really strong. They demonstrated critical engagement with a question. I used the real world example of a news story and asked them to think about it. And they could answer me in ways that really showed they could see how power is reproduced in language and images, etc. And then the questions that they asked were actually fantastic as well. So each week I would open up a discussion topic where they could ask their own questions. And the questions were not just what does this mean, but the questions were quite nuanced about these topics and how they apply to different contexts, which really showed that there was some of this critical literacy and some of the signs of that taking place. Students could reflect the main outcome of the course, which was really encouraging for me, and I could see this in the exams and in the forums, etc. And that is that they recognize that texts are constructed through choices that reflect ideologies and power relations within contexts. So they could show me those types of understanding taking place, and that's why I'm encouraged that some of the approaches that I used, maybe not all of them, were quite effective in this critical literacy framework. So these are the three strategies I used, and I'll just show you for about 5 minutes examples of each of them, and I'll speak to how I use them and why I think that they're effective in the critical literacy framework. So the first one is forum discussions that link texts to contexts, multiple choice questions with multi-correct options that were used as formative assessments, and these I at least feel really test the application of knowledge. And then I require them to bring their own texts and experiences and respond to one another, which emulates, at least to some degree, that conversational element that critical literacy requires. The first and definitely the most important component of my courses for developing critical literacy were the forum discussions. So these forum discussions would be posted each week, and students would be asked to check a declaration within their weekly online test saying that they had responded to the forums, and this really got everyone to do it. Almost every student posted forum responses each week. In this example, this is just one of the examples of what I did. I would post a news story of some kind, in this case a video of Trevor Noah, and then I would ask them to think about the context that this media story was constructed within. And you can see question number 2 there. How does the news change as it is conveyed through different modes and genres? Do you consider the video clip to be news or comedy? So thinking about genre, thinking about context in that way, thinking about how texts are shaped by contexts and texts are developed through choices by producers of these texts, all of these things being tested in application to an actual text in context. So these were actually developed with my teaching assistant, Fatima Issa, who helped a lot with the online discussions, and having a teaching assistant was a big asset. I know it's not always possible for us, but it was very hard for me personally to go through all of the forum responses each week, even though I did look at most of them. So I think collaborative and teamwork can really work well as well for critical literacy in the online space. These are some of the responses that I got to the forum discussions, and what I liked here is I asked each of them also to respond to another student. So they had to really show that they were thinking about what was happening. But in the forums, I also had some questions that they asked where they really were trying to critically engage with the content. So these were some great examples, and I love that the students took initiative and actually went for explaining the concepts to each other. So the first question there, does the media know that we know their techniques of selecting information that serves certain people's interests? This is just what one student asked in the forum, and then another student responds, yes. However, their techniques have been accustomed to us and make it unconsciously to question them. That's how I think. So this great response, I think, fantastic understanding of the context and actually explaining it to another student shows us that this is the second example is the same. So they are starting to really critically engage with us and see it as affecting them and affecting how they experience text as well. And the second student, I think, wonderful explanation of social constructions and how gives a nice example as well. It's an example that I use, so they might be reproducing my examples from class, but at least it shows that they're understanding how the contexts work, and very nice paraphrasing of the example there to explain these concepts in context. Then the second technique that I used that I think was also quite effective, and it's something that I'm a big advocate for, and something that students absolutely hate because it takes a long time. This type of question can actually take 10 minutes of real close thinking, going back to their notes, etc., for them to finish. But I wanted them to really think closely about these multiple choice questions, which were it's the easiest thing to do with a group of 320. You can't go and individually mark tests each week for them, or even read through forum chats each week, but this is a space where they can get feedback. So I would give them these types of questions where they would have a text, and sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's a little bit of just linguistic text, and for them to really go and think about what's happening within that text. And so many different responses here are correct, and they will get negative marking for the incorrect answer. So they really need to think closely about each option. Does this option apply or does it not apply? And this gets them to really critically think about the content and apply it in context. And I think this is one of the ways that that deeper thinking could happen, where they really look at the text closely and think about it. So sometimes I would give them, for example, I gave them an image of Cyril Ramaphosa, and I asked them, what is being shown to us in this image. And then there were multiple different options that they could choose from, and I would give them a mark for each one that would apply to the image. And if they chose something that doesn't apply to the image, then they would lose a mark for that, and I would give a little bit of feedback and explanation afterwards as well. So this is an example as well of how I used a visual text, and I asked them to really think about how the concepts we've learned in class apply to this visual text. What is being said here? What is being communicated? If this is used in a news story, what does it say about that news story? So I asked them to use these multiple choice questions with multiple correct answers in order to critically engage with what's happening in that text. And you can see some of the responses they could choose from below. And then the final strategy I used was asking students to bring their own text. I had a few forum discussions that asked them to do this, where they have to go out and actually look in their own contexts at their own media that they're exposed to and think of how does this apply to what we're doing. Right, so the second question there, explain how this image positions you in relation to the news story. What is this image doing? And there they really need to go apply the ideas that they have from the class. And then I also asked another student in the class to reply to each post, and I asked them to really think of what would happen if another image had been used in place. And I think this type of question really gets that critical thinking going around what choices were being made, how does that relate to the way that these news stories position us. So bringing their own text was fantastic, and I'll show you an example of a text that a student brought and how they discussed it in the forum. So one student brought an image from the racial justice protests in America and the police reform issues that are happening there, and they showed this image being used in relation to the story, and they showed how we're shown images of chaos, of potential violence. There's a bit of fear-mongering taking place, and then the response is also great. If they had used a different image, we might have, many things are being excluded here. We don't know why they're protesting. Maybe they could have shown us that the families are furious, that there is violence from the police's side going on as well, instead of just the destruction of property that we see here. So they kind of get an idea of how texts are constructed within context, and that things are being omitted and selected in these images. So what did I learn from trying to teach this first year course with a critical literacy angle to it? And the first thing I learned, and the most important thing when I did some feedback on this, was the students really want to hear your voice. I used a lot of text-based low data approaches because I was very conscious of students not always having the space or the time to listen to PowerPoints, but they really wanted it. So either the narrated PowerPoints or just recorded videos of you as the lecturer, they want to connect with you as a person, and I'll definitely be doing that much more often in future. I learned that this kind of very strict schedule didn't always work. So trying to say Monday I'll open it, Friday I'll close it, and then I'll give you this other question on Saturday that you can consider over the next week. I think there's a lot of fluidity that needs to take place in the online space. So especially when you really want students to engage closely, we need to kind of be cognizant of the fact that there are the spaces to do that. And also kind of remembering that most students work from their cell phones. They have to travel somewhere perhaps to have connectivity, and therefore I couldn't have multiple tasks per week. I needed to give them either tasks that could all be completed at the same time, or tasks that were very straightforward and simple that they could do offline as well, so they could just download them. So all of these different types of things were restrictions in a sense to what I could really do in that online space, but I'll definitely use this going forward for any of the online courses I teach. So thanks very much for listening to this presentation. I'd very much welcome any feedback. I'd like to turn this into more strategies for online teaching and critical literacy specifically. So any feedback or questions would be very much appreciated. Thank you.